I know it wasn't last year, and I don't even know if it was in 2019, so I'm wondering if it was 2018. So it's been a little bit, but it's good to be back with you. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Jim Lorenz. I'm the ministerial director, and you may go, what is that? And I kind of jokingly say, especially for pastors and churches, it's kind of like the 411, information, or 911, if the information, if they didn't get the information in time or whatever it was. So, but I'm going to ask you to do something as a church. We talk about in the Bible to spur one another unto love and to good deeds. I'm going to ask you this. When was the last time you thanked your children's Sabbath school teachers for the ministry they do? I will tell you this much. My wife teaches juniors at our home church in Pleasant Hill, and almost never has a parent come up and say, thank you for all the hours you put into my kids. We aren't, as churches, really good at saying thank you. And so I'm going to challenge you. Spur one another unto love and good deeds, because one of the single best things that you can do to do that is to tell your ministry leaders thank you. The Sabbath school secretary who passes out the stuff each Sabbath, my guess is nobody has said thank you to that person ever. So potluck people, whomever, I want this church to be known as a church who thanks its ministry leaders. And so I'm going to challenge you on that one, to spur one another unto love and to good deeds. And the best thing you can do is say thank you. And by the way, even if you can't go to the second step, the best step you can do is actually write a little note. That way they can save it. And believe me, they will. But if you can't even push yourself to do that, at least say thank you. So, I want to tell you several stories today. And the first story takes place in the year 1115. We're going back 1,000 years. And I want you to meet two people, Peter and Heloise, and Uncle Fulbert. Now, Heloise, we believe at this point, is probably an orphan, and she's gone to live with her Uncle Fulbert, and we're talking about in the Paris area. And so Uncle Fulbert wants the best for his niece, and so he hires her a tutor. Now, we're saying 1,000 years ago, girls didn't get a lot of education back then. He hires her the best, Peter. Peter is a rising star at Notre Dame. And so remember, at that time, that was very much of a church school, Notre Dame was. And in Paris, by the way. And so one thing leads to another, and Peter's a young man, Heloise is a young woman, and the two fall in love. And then Uncle Fulbert finds out. Uncle Fulbert is kind of like, hey, I did not hire you to fall in love with my niece. To be her tutor, yes. Lover, boyfriend, no. And so he then says, this is over, we're done. Forbids them to see each other. He's starting to think Romeo and Juliet. And yes, the two did not want to be separated. And so they sneak back together, continued to see each other. And one thing leads to another, and oops, Heloise finds out she is pregnant. And things then start to get really complicated. Uncle Fulbert finds out eventually. He is furious, and his hospitality has been outraged. He is very upset, rightfully so. And this is where we start finding out the strengths and the weaknesses of the characters in our story. So, Peter, out of self-interest, Uncle Fulbert is basically saying, she's pregnant, you guys are getting married. Now, keep in mind, Peter works for the church. In fact, he is known to be a rising star in the church and the best teacher at Notre Dame. And here is the one catch. Maybe you've already caught it. There was only one church at that time. And if you are going to be a rising star in the church, all of you know you cannot be married. And Peter is like, you want me to be married? He wants to do the right thing, but he's kind of got career over here, Heloise over here. How do you work these two? So he agrees. He says, but can we just not tell anybody? And this is where we start seeing the strength of Heloise's character too. Oddly enough, it's Heloise who objects to being married. She would rather suffer the shame and the scorn of being an unwed mother than for his career in the church to be cut short. And so she says, no, I do not want to get married. Not because she doesn't love him, she loves him desperately, but because she knows the church's stand. And that if he gets married, it's gonna make his career in the church. And this guy's a rising star. She just feels like she doesn't want to stand in the way of that. But they do get married secretly, privately, and they don't tell anybody. Well, the challenge is Heloise is pregnant, eventually gives birth, and people start talking. Who's the father? Well, pretty soon they start kind of figuring out a little bit about who's the father, and Heloise is unmarried, and what's Uncle Fulbert doing about this? And Uncle Fulbert, after a while, gets so frustrated with the way the story is being told about him that he says, time out. You know she is married, by the way. And that's when people are going, really? She is? To Peter? We didn't know that. So they go to Heloise and go, really? Are you really married? And she goes, no, we're not. We're not married. In fact, she says, I'll even swear on the Bible. She is willing to go to those lengths. And then, if the story wasn't already strange enough, it goes from the strange to the ugly. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but let's just say that Uncle Fulbert at some point gets really, really upset at Peter because he thinks maybe he's cheating on her. Hires thugs, they go and beat him up. Peter later will hire his own thugs to go beat up Uncle Fulbert, and with the church's power, take all this stuff too. And eventually, because they cannot live together, Peter says, you know what, to Heloise, you and I should live as brother and sister. You go join a convent, I'm going to be in a monastery. We're going to be brother and sister. They will exchange letters over the years. Her letters have trickled down to us. They're considered now classic literature, letters of Heloise. He will die and come to be buried in her convent. She will look over his tomb for the next 22 years and eventually be united with him in death next to him. It is truly a tragic Romeo and Juliet story. And you and I are going, this is so messed up on so many levels because it never needed to happen that way. But because they had a distorted view that if you're going to be a really spiritual person, you could not be married, it led to lying, it led to violence, and a separated couple, husband or wife. And we just shake our heads and we're going, it did not need to be because that's not what the Bible says. I want to share with you another story. Another story about Friedrich Nietzsche. You know, the guy who infamously said that God is dead, that Nietzsche. But his biggest criticism of the church deals with this. He says the church is anti-nature. And here's what he means by that. He really means is that When it comes to if it feels good, if it tastes good, if it looks good, maybe even it sounds good, stay away from it. And you're kind of like going, In fact, listen to what he says. He says, to attack the passions at their roots means to attack life at its roots. The practice of the church is hostile to life. The practice of the church is hostile to life. And before we're too hard on him, maybe we need to look at his story. You see, Nietzsche, who became later a famous atheist, critic of Christianity, did not grow up that way. He grew up in a very strict Lutheran home. In fact, his dad was a Lutheran minister. Now, if that's what turned him to saying his big criticism of the church is anti-nature, that the church is hostile to life, I don't know. He would not be the first pastor's kid to have felt that way. I remember a number of years ago when I was at camp meeting. Now, you have to understand, when you're a pastor at camp meeting, it means you're working there. Okay, and some of the jobs are not always that pleasant. And maybe the bottom end of all the jobs there is putting out and picking up the porta potties. All right? Now, let me describe what that is like. You're on a trailer that is not clean, but that's the least of your concerns. As you're going around dusty camp meeting, you are breathing in the dust of the truck that is kicking dust on you to where you are just coated with dust. You're hoping that the porta potty cleaning crew got to the porta potties and cleaned them and didn't just pump them, which is often what happens, is that you're just having to pick up porta potties that have been pumped but not cleaned. Okay, that is the pastor's life up there. Now you're beginning to understand how pastors view that trolley, that trailer, as you're going around camp meeting, as kind of almost a timbrel of going to the gallows. I mean, and so it is not a lot of fun. And so you're saying, okay, we might as well make the best of it because it's got to be done. And so we're on the trailer, and we're kind of joking around. It's kind of like, you know what, this is the pits, but let's have some fun. And we're telling humorous church stories that have happened to us. Some of them are pretty funny. And there was an old pastor on the trailer with us, helping us, who did not think that you should be telling humorous stories, because Christians shouldn't laugh and tell humorous stories. And so he gets in my face and starts quoting Ellen White to me. Random Ellen White quotes. I'm like, really? Really? Now, I was a young pastor at that time, and so I just took it quietly. Now, I would not put up with such shenanigans. I would tell him, you may know quotes, but you don't know Ellen White. You don't know that she had a great sense of humor. She would joke about her weight. In fact, one of the times that, story, and I'm just giving you two examples, is when on a warm Sabbath afternoon, and remember, this is in pre-air conditioning days, summer afternoons in church, if you're having an afternoon meeting, it is warm in there, people have eaten, and they are sleepy. Her son, Willie White, falls asleep behind her as she's speaking. People are looking back at Willie White, saying he fell asleep on his mom. Yeah, he's an adult, he should know better. She looks back and makes a joke about it. That's who she was. And by the way, did you know this about Ellen White? That she said that every young woman should have at least one red dress? Did you know that? In fact, the young women who would stay with her when she was living at Elmshaven by PUC, these young women who are going to PUC, if they did not have a red dress, she would buy the cloth for them and then help them make the dress. Was Nietzsche's father like that Adventist pastor I encountered on that porta potty trailer? I don't know. Is that what turned him away from God into thinking Christians, the church, is hostile to life. If I'd lived in that Adventist pastor's home, I might have been with Nietzsche. Or was it Lou that turned Nietzsche away from the church into thinking the church is hostile to life? You see, Lou was the love of Nietzsche's life. She grew up in a very strict home also. She had what we call Platonic view of marriage. He would actually propose marriage to her 3 times, and 3 times she'd say no. Her view of marriage was you live as brother and sister. Remember Peter and Heloise? That was her view of marriage. And was it because of that that Nietzsche says the church is hostile to life? We don't know. But we do know who to blame for his view. Plato. And see, when I say that to you, most Christians have no idea how big an impact Plato has had on the church. We come to church week in and week out, and we will say different things, never realizing that we may actually be spouting Platonic talk that is not found in here. Just like that old Adventist pastor who was with us on that porta potty trailer. You see, if there are philosophers amongst us, forgive me for my oversimplification of Platonic thought or the Platonic dualism, but let me give it to you very, very simply. Platonic dualism, it means two things. He believes heaven is good, earth is bad. Thought, or what he calls the soul is good, body bad. Now, some of you are going, wait, just a second. Did you just say soul good, body bad? Yeah, I did. You see, that's Plato's thought. But you and I are thinking, hold it, that's not what Genesis 2:7 says. Genesis 2:7 says the body and the breath are the soul. And so that's not Plato's thought. Plato separates the soul out from the body as this other thing. And Christians have bought into that hook, line, and sinker. In fact, Adventists have been really good against that type of Platonic thought, the splitting out of the soul. That half of it we're really good about. We're saying that is not what the soul is about. When we talk about the state of the dead, what happens when a person dies. We're good about that. Where we are not good is the other end of that equation. We'll talk about the soul, but we don't talk about the body. And that's where we suffer, and where that Adventist pastor I just shared with you a few moments ago had gone. He had bought into Platonic thought, not knowing it. And we as Adventists, we're good at talking about the soul and saying Plato's wrong about that. But we've also got to be good about talking about what Plato's also wrong about with the body. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How Plato has impacted us. Alarm bells should be going off in your head. Because Plato's idea of anything that dealt with the body, from sleeping to eating to enjoying life, was condemned. We're going to be talking about Christians who know about this. But this is not new to Christianity. Christianity has been dealing with this. In fact, we see this type of thought creeping up in the Bible, and it is so destructive that people were saying soul good, body bad, that the New Testament church is battling that. Because do you know what the Platonist Christians were saying? They were saying, if the body is bad and the soul is good, what type of God would ever think about coming down in bodily form? No real God would do that, because this body's obviously bad. 1 John 4:2, this is one of those passages, this is the story behind this passage. 1 John 4:2, by this you know The Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus has come in the flesh is from God. What's John saying? If you're saying that Jesus could not have had a real physical body because you believe what Plato believes, you're wrong. That's what he's saying. It's destructive on many different levels, including what some people were saying about Jesus. So let me introduce one other person that you maybe don't know how much has impacted the church. That is Augustine. If you know anything about Catholic theology, Augustine is one of the major church fathers. He, by the way, was what they call a Neo-Platonist. Yes, he believed in Plato. Not everything, but he started kind of helping codify these different concepts about if you're going to be truly spiritual, a priest and a nun would not be married. Stuff like that. And you start looking at how different the church was, especially the medieval church, from Jewish life. And you're just going, wow, you would have people flagellating themselves, beating themselves, doing all kinds of things, sitting on poles to show how spiritual they are. You never see that type of thing in Judaism. And yet it creeps into our lives, our spiritual lives, and we start going, well, no, I think sitting on a pole is kind of crazy. But we know people like that Adventist pastor I just mentioned a few moments ago. And we have struggled with it ever since. Even Protestantism. John Calvin, who is one of the major founders of Protestantism, would call bodies, numerous times, prison houses for the soul. That doesn't sound very complimentary of bodies. In fact, kind of saying, you really shouldn't be enjoying life too much. Have you ever known Christians who, if they tasted bad, looked bad, was out of fashion, that was their faith? Their whole faith comes down to what you eat and what you wear. I remember being a groomsman a number of years ago, just out of college, when my friend was getting married, his family, German background, as is mine. And you got to know something about German cooking. I mean, German cooking has two huge ingredients, butter and cream. All right, it's good stuff. And I'm telling my wife, we're going to be going to the rehearsal dinner. I'm looking forward to good food. And I just started, my wife had been dating over the summer, a little bit, about 6 months by the time. And I'm saying, okay, now you're going to experience some German cooking. Okay, we get there. And the rehearsal dinner, I'm ready to load up. Unfortunately, my friend's parents had not discovered that you could be a Christian and have tasty food. It was the type of food that you take 2 bites. The first bite is shock. The second bite is awe. And you're just going, oh no, oh no. Because you're hungry. You're going, I am not putting this stuff in my body. This is a celebratory dinner. Their son is getting married, and they're giving us this stuff. This is the type of food that you immediately start looking around. Where's the trash can? And is anybody watching me as I try and ditch this food? It's that bad. Disappointment. And I hate to tell you this, dessert was even worse. I think they were attempting trifle. All I can tell you was it was gray. Trifle is not supposed to be gray. It looked like wet cement and it tasted like wet cement. And again, you're just going, you know what? You're going to have to put me on an island where there is no other food available for months before I'm going to be eating this stuff. So you ditch it, and afterwards, my girlfriend and I went and looked for a Taco Bell. It's like, But what would prompt them to think that you shouldn't have tasty food? It was bad. And I think, unfortunately, my friend had allowed Platonic thinking to creep into their faith. And it manifested itself in lousy food. Don't overlook a key fact. You don't find a book in the Bible written by Plato. He is pagan. I'm not saying that everything he said was wrong, but some of his key concepts are. And we as a church have been really good, as I said a moment ago, about saying Plato is wrong about the soul. We need to be equally good at saying he's also wrong about the body. And we have not been as good about coming back to that. I want you to open up your Bibles. You have to see this passage. It was our scripture passage, Nehemiah 8. And if you don't have this passage underlined in your Bible, you need to. If you only have an electronic Bible, then figure out a way to underline, highlight this passage so you can come back to it. This passage needs to be underlined in your Bible because there are Platonic Christians amongst us. You're going to come across them. You know who I'm talking about. Maybe even you grew up in a family like this who thought that faith is a strict, rigid, no fun thing. And sadly, I got to say, if that is the home you grew up in, praise the Lord, you're still in the church. Because we have lost so many people needlessly because that was the God that was betrayed. You have to see this passage again. Here's the context. Here's the context. I'm going to read to you Nehemiah 8. We're going to start, I think, around verse 9. You have to stand in the context. It says, Nehemiah, the governor, Ezra, and the priest and scribe and Levites who were instructing the people said to them all, "This day is sacred to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for all the people have been weeping as they listened to the words of the law." Okay, they've rediscovered the law. These people have come back. Remember, they were in captivity, and now they're back. And they're reading to them the law, saying, we got to rediscover our faith. And if you're an evangelist, you're going, wow, this is awesome. These people are convicted. They're weeping. They're crying. They're feeling a conviction. And on one hand, we'd be saying, that's great. But you got to remember, this is a feast. And on sacred days in Judaism, you don't fast. They don't fast. The only time they would fast on a sacred day is if it would Yom Kippur fall on that. In fact, Sabbath, they do not fast on Sabbath unless it's Yom Kippur. And that's rare. As you think about how often that could happen, it's going to be extremely rare. In fact, if there's sitting Shiva, which is when your loved one has died for 7 days, you know that's going to cross a Sabbath. You break Shiva for Sabbath. You do not fast on Sabbath. And so when I hear Adventists, other Christians coming to me saying, I'm going to fast this Sabbath, I'm thinking, you have no idea what you're talking about. That is not what the Sabbath is about. Read with me this passage again. Nehemiah 8, verse 10. Nehemiah said, "Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks, and send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is sacred to the Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." The Levites calmed all the people, saying, "Be still, for this is a sacred day. Do not grieve." They're telling them, stop grieving. This is a joyous day. We got to make sure that we have matched the joy with the day. And too often, we come to church with these frowns on our faces, this obligation worship, and we have not matched the joy of the day. If it's a sacred day, it is joyful. It is not supposed to be, I'm here again. Let's get it over with. I go around churches and I see that all the time. And we have got to address that. The joy of the Lord is your strength. And that should impact your Sabbath. We have got to rediscover God's strength to us. Here we have, what was one of the great accusations made against Jesus? That he had too good of a time. He was a drunkard and a glutton. No, we know that's coming from his critics. But it does tell us something. It does tell us that Jesus could be around a good time. And that needs to tell us something. That we have got to stop saying, if the clothes are in fashion, if it tastes good, if it feels good, it's always bad. No. Situations will dictate what is appropriate. But we as Christians cannot give this message out to the world that Friedrich Nietzsche believes about Christianity, that the church is hostile to life. Because he's not all wrong. He's sadly right in some of his accusations. I want to read to you from Ellen White a statement where she says this: thousands have a false conception of God and his attributes. They are verily serving a false God, as were the servants of Baal. A false image of God is like serving an idol. That's what she's saying. I want to tell you about a young ministerial student who, because of Plato's definition of the soul, that the soul is eternal, immortal, and it burns in hell, has a chance of burning in hell if you don't do exactly what God says, decided that he could not accept a God like that. You and I would say that's a false image of God. That young ministerial student who was studying for the ministry, do you know what his name was? Charles Darwin. Another young ministerial student we've been talking about is Friedrich Nietzsche. Could not take the church's definition of the body, and then became also an atheist and critic of the church. And the tragedy is they were rejecting a false image of God. And look where that has left us, with two of the biggest critics of the church. Darwin with a system that parallels Christianity and says, you know what, you don't have to believe in Christianity, you can have this other path. And it comes back to a false picture of God. And they fully rejected it. But you and I have a message to share with individuals like that. I want to finish with a couple of different concepts. One is the false concept of I have secular life and I have spiritual life. I have work life during the week, and then I got church life on Sabbath. And we have people who live that way. It's kind of like when I go to work, they'll say I'm a totally different person. I use a work language. I will use work methods, kind of like dog eat dog. When I come to church, I can sing all the hymns. I can say all the prayers. That is a false picture of what a Christian is supposed to be. Because to a Jew in Jesus' day, they would say, I don't even know what you're talking about. That you have a secular life and a spiritual life. Because they would say, no, it's all one. It's all one. In fact, we see this with Paul. What does Paul say? He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. Do it all. Whatever you do it all to the glory of God. He's not saying, hey, do the spiritual things to God and do the rest of the stuff whenever. No, he says, everything. In fact, in Romans 12:1, he will say something very similar where he says, present your bodies as living sacrifices. He doesn't say just on Sabbath. It's all the time. And some of you are going, but what does that look like? Does that mean that I have to basically turn my home into a monastery where it's no more fun? No, that's not what he was saying. That's not the Jewish concept of life. I can go to Disneyland. I can have a good time. I'm not going to do it on Sabbath because that's special to God. I can eat ice cream. I'm just not going to eat it all the time because unfortunately calories count. As much as I like ice cream. We have got to recover God's concept of how he wants us to live. Because otherwise what you and I are doing is making a false image of God that people outside these doors are rejecting. They say, I don't want that God. And rightfully so. We've got to be careful about the hedonistic and the Platonic view of God. The Platonic view of God says, I'm only going to focus on God. I'm going to ignore his gifts to me. Because his gifts to me, they're worthless. He didn't mean for me to really enjoy life. The hedonistic Christian says, I only focus on the gifts and I ignore God. Neither one of those extremes are good. We come together and we can say, I'm going to focus on the Creator and I can enjoy his creation at the same time. I want to finish with a story. Some of you are familiar with the story of Babette's Feast. Babette's Feast takes place during the French Revolution, and there are these two elderly women living together. They are part of a very small, very severe, strict religious group. It used to be a church, and now it's probably more and more like a small group. Maybe it's 12 people. And you understand why. Their names are Philippa and Martine, named after the founders of the Lutheran Church. Philip Melanchthon and Martin Luther, Philippa and Martine. If I was to use one word to describe everything in their life, from what they wore to what they ate to their faith, this one word would be gray. Life was not meant to be enjoyed. Life was meant to be just endured. Until Babette shows up at their home. Fleeing the terrors of France, she shows up at their home. Now, she's an outsider. She looks like a very worldly woman, and they're not really sure about her, but since she has a letter of introduction from a mutual friend, they said, okay, we got to take her in. So they reluctantly take in this worldly woman, and she cleans house for them. She will cook their food, and their food, by the way, is gruel. It's gray, too. Remember I said it's gray. It's gruel. That's what she prepares for them all the time. You just kind of trudge through life. Life's an obligation. Faith is an obligation. About 14 years pass, and a letter arrives for Babette, saying that she has won the French lottery. This is met with mixed emotion. They're happy for her, obviously. They're good people, so they're happy for her. But over these 14 years, she's kind of wormed her way into their hearts. And now they're going, she's won this money, she's probably going back to France, and we really don't want her to leave. We kind of like her now. But then she makes a request. She says, can I make you a dinner, a real dinner? And she can see on their faces that they're thinking, that is not who we are. We don't do those type of dinners. And she can see it. She says, I've never asked for anything before, right? They go, no. She says, I just want to ask this one thing, that I can prepare a dinner in honor of your father. Oh boy. How can they say no? They feel stuck. Okay, I guess you can. So they're actually going behind the scenes, talking to the other members of this small, severe group, strict group, religious group, and saying, okay, we're going to eat, but we're not going to feast. We're going to eat, but we're not going to feast. And I got to pause for a second. Have you thought about in the Old Testament how many times the Jews are commanded to feast? I mean, what kind of God commands you to feast? Think about it. But this group doesn't want to feast because they have bought into that Platonic notion of faith. In fact, they even go so far as to say, call it behind her back a satanic Sabbath. That's what she's preparing. Okay? So that when the evening comes, the table is lavishly set. I mean, it's amazing. Exotic foods. They're eating. And at first they're silent because they were not going to compliment the food. And they're slowly eating. There's one guy there, though, that's an outsider, and he's just going crazy. He's going, this is the best I've ever had. He goes, I've only had food like this in one other place in Paris. He goes, this is amazing. Everybody else is kind of like quietly eating. But the food starts doing something to them. Keep in mind the Bible. How many times in the Bible do you have food as part of the story? And there's a reason for it. And the food starts working on this group that was not always getting along. And bridges start being formed and bonds are rebuilt with this group. And eventually they will leave that night different than they came. Afterwards, Babette's tired. And the two women are just, the food was good. And they're just kind of relaxing. But now kind of sadness because now that's over, Babette's going to be leaving them. And Babette then drops a bombshell on them. The first thing she says is, no, I'm not leaving because I spent all the money on the meal. Secondly, she then reveals that she was the world-renowned chef in Paris. And she just made what she would have made in her restaurant for them. And these women almost missed it. Missed it. It's hard to appreciate the Creator unless you appreciate His creation. It's hard to appreciate the gift giver unless you can say thank you for the gift. And it's hard to appreciate grace unless you recognize it for what it is. I want you to say these words with me. This is a holy day. Do not be sad. Holy day. Do not be sad. One last one. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Let's say it together. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. May you and I appreciate our Creator as we appreciate His creation. We're going to sing a song here in a moment. I got to tell you the background if you don't know the background. Isaac Watts wrote this song. It was considered the contemporary Christian music of his era. And you're going to see in the second verse of the song, this line, let those who refuse to sing who never knew our God. That's really kind of a slam line. Like if you're not singing, then you really don't know God. Okay? You got to know. Because there was a group of Christians at the time who said, you know what? If it doesn't come directly from a psalm, it's not worth singing. And he's going, that's not the way it is. He said, Christians should be able to enjoy life. And so you're going to see themes that we just talked about in this song. And so let's sing it together.